So in your trade barriers, you should be able to discuss in detail about सबसे पहले टैरिफ्स के बारे में हमने बोला ये एक इनडायरेक्ट टैक्स है, ये इंपोर्टेड गुड्स एंड सर्विसेज पे लगता है और ये इंपोर्टेड गुड को एक्सपेंसिव करता है. So the way the diagram goes is like this. So I'll make demand, supply, price, quantity. Demand के साथ I'm marking a small d, supply के साथ I'm marking a small d as well. What it basically means, S के साथ जो D है, it basically means domestic supply, और DD के साथ this is domestic demand. Basically what we have is, let's suppose I talk about a product, an LPG cylinders. Now LPG cylinders in Pakistan is important for those areas जहाँ पे gas lines वगैरह नहीं है, usually the remote areas of the country, interiors के अंदर वगैरह. So basically, since people have to use these LPG cylinders for cooking and whatever they need for cars and stuff, so obviously at high prices the demand for cylinders will be low, at low prices the demand will be high. That's how consumers feel about it. Then you have some domestic producers. SD represents the willingness and ability of domestic producers. So at low price, they will be willing to supply less because less encouragement. And as the price goes up, they will be willing to supply more and more. As a result of that, what happens is, एक market के अंदर इस product की domestic price set हो जाती है. So PD represents the domestic price. Now let's suppose the domestic price for an LPG cylinder is about 400 rupees and X number of units are sold domestically. So I'll mark QD as domestic quantity traded. As far as the revenue goes, जो domestic producers इस वक्त revenue कमा रहे हैं, that is PO into QO, this entire region is the domestic producers revenue. So if I was to give like a quantity, let's say this is 40 units. So if I was to take out the revenue, my current total revenue in the market is 400 into 400 units, which gives me about 160,000, I believe. Yeah, 1,60,000. This is the current revenue, is what I'm trying to show here. Up the thing is, if you are open to international trade, then you can try and find product at cheaper rates. Let's say they say that China is able to produce LPG cylinders at half the rate of what we are producing. Now naturally Pakistan ke andar you have what, say 3 companies maybe producing LPG cylinders. But once you go into the world market, now all the countries are open to trade, जिसके अंदर countries with a lot more firms, a lot more efficient firms with much more larger quantities. So basically we make a line showing that at half the price, यानी rupees 200 के ऊपर, ये world price है. PW represents the world price, यानी दुनिया के अंदर at the price of 200 I can actually buy as many LPG cylinders as I want. I'll call it SW. SW basically means world सप्लाई, बिकॉज दुनिया में इतने सारे प्रोड्यूसर्स हैं, जैसे हमारे यहाँ ऑयल में भी होता है, ऑयल की एक इंटरनेशनल प्राइस है जिसके ऊपर तुमको जितनी क्वांटिटीज चाहिए, बिकॉज वर्ल्ड इज प्रोबेबली डीलिंग इन बिलियंस ऑफ मेट्रिक्स, और आपकी कंट्री की जो रिक्वायरमेंट है दैट इज जस्ट इन अ फ्यू हंड्रेड्स ऑफ थाउजेंड्स और मे बी ए कपल ऑफ मिलियंस और सो दुनिया में आपको 200 की प्राइस के ऊपर जितने एलपीजी सिलेंडर्स चाहिए आपको मिलेंगे. सो ये बेसिकली वर्ल्ड प्राइस हो जाती है. नाउ सिंस द वर्ल्ड प्राइस इज लोअर, it's at 200, the thing is consumers at 200 की price will be willing to buy a lot more quantities. This is what the consumers are willing to buy. लेकिन डोमेस्टिकली देखा जाए तो Q1 is the quantity being produced domestically, because जब domestic producers will try to compete at international price, उनके लिए incentive कम हो जाएगा and they'll be producing a lot lesser quantity. If I was to give numbers, let's say I'll say this is like 200 and the quantity demanded is 600. So clearly we can see that there is a pretty big shortage at the world price. And what's really going to happen is 200 की price पे domestic producers are just going to supply 200 units. ये जो additional shortage है 400 units का, that will be imported from abroad. As far as the domestic producers revenue goes, unfortunately 200 की प्राइस के ऊपर Q1 is the maximum they will be able to supply. So the new revenue is 200 into 200 quantity, which is just 40,000, a lot lesser. So unfortunately जो domestic producers हैं, they are not happy about it. जो कि domestic consumers हैं, they should be very happy, because at the price of 200 they are consuming about 600 units. तो domestic producers जो है वो अच्छी खासी quantity consume कर सकेंगे. So for them, अगर उनका expenditure measure करो consumer का, तो एक तो अच्छी बात यह है कि वो कम price के ऊपर ज़्यादा quantity consume करेंगे. If we take out their expenditure, so their expenditure is basically 200 की price पे 600 units, so they are spending lesser and consuming more. So now if you see the numbers before, originally consumers were spending about 160,000 rupees just to consume 400 units. जो पुराना revenue था, PD into QD. Producers were much more in a better off position. In a new situation, consumers are paying lower price and consuming 600 units, a lot more. Of this, इतना तो domestic producers को जा रहा है, और ये वाला जो area है, the light green, that basically tells के जो foreigners हैं, जो import हो रही है, वो हो रहे हैं 200 की प्राइस पे 400 यूनिट, so about 80,000. $80,000 is going to the foreigners import quantities में, और इसी का जो बेसिकली तुम्हारे पास लेफ्ट ओवर अमाउंट है वो डोमेस्टिक प्रोड्यूसर्स के पास जा रहा है. तो what I'll highlight here is consumers का जो 120,000 का कंजम्पशन है उसमें से 80,000 फॉरेनर के पास जा रहा है और 40,000 जो है डोमेस्टिक प्रोड्यूसर्स के पास जा रहा है। बिफोर इंपोर्ट 160,000 का जो कंज्यूमर का एक्सपेंडिचर था वो सारा प्रोड्यूसर के पास जा रहा था। सो क्लियरली what we can sum up with this is that consumers benefit, foreigners benefit, but domestic producers are not at an advantage. Now, domestic producers are going to complain to the government that listen, our local LPG cylinders is really suffering because जब quantities domestic 400 से 200 पे जाएगा तो probably some firms are going to go out of business. Domestic employment is going to fall as a result of this. So they're going to protest, and if their protest works, the government can introduce tariffs. Let's suppose it was a successful protest and the government imposes 50% tariff on all imports. So 50% on the import goods लगेंगे तो your price is gonna go up to 300 because 50% of 200 is another 100 रुपए। अब बेसिकली जितनी भी बाहर से गुड्स इंपोर्ट होकर आएंगी उसके ऊपर एक टैरिफ का रेट लगेगा। तो आई राइट PW यानी वर्ल्ड प्राइस प्लस टैरिफ, तो जो कि अब हो गया 300, और मेरी जो वर्ल्ड सप्लाई विद टैरिफ है आई कॉल इट SW प्लस T। सो बेसिकली दिस वाज वर्ल्ड सप्लाई एंड नाउ दिस इज वर्ल्ड supply with tariffs। तो अब प्रोडक्ट की प्राइस बढ़ जाती है। अब जब प्रोडक्ट की प्राइस बढ़ती है तो what's going to happen? Well, if we look here, अब जो हमारा क्वांटिटी सप्लाइड है डोमेस्टिक और क्वांटिटी डिमांडेड है उसमें कुछ चेंजेस आ गए हैं। Because the prices have gone up, domestic producers will be able to charge a little higher price, so they'll be able to produce a little more quantity, let's say 300 units. But since the price have risen, there's going to be a slight reduction in the quantity demanded also, let's say 500. So now the quantity being imported has reduced, the import levels have fallen, and that's what the tariffs का trade barriers का idea था कि imports के अंदर reduction लेकर आना। Now as far as the number goes, if we look at what is happening to the domestic producers के revenue को, well fortunately domestic प्रोड्यूसर्स का जो रेवेन्यू है दैट इज नाउ 300 के रेट पे, बिकॉज लोकल प्रोडक्ट पे तो टैरिफ नहीं लगेंगे, तो डोमेस्टिक प्रोड्यूसर्स विल गेट द इंटायर 300 bucks and they're going to supply about 300 units, so that's 90,000 up from our previous situation of 40,000। ओरिजिनल क्या था 200 की प्राइस के ऊपर 200 units। So now the revenue has gone up. Let me highlight it. So your new revenue is this purple region, which is a lot more than our previous region. Okay, what about consumers? How much money are they going to be spending in this whole thing? So जहाँ तक consumption की बात है, unfortunately for the consumers, the price has gone up and the quantity demanded has gone down. So at about 300, the consumers are buying 500. So we have about a spending of 150,000 की spending by consumers, of which इंपोर्टर्स को जा रहे हैं. इंपोर्टर्स को तो वही 200 रुपये मिलेंगे. इंपोर्टर्स को तो कोई खास फर्क नहीं आएगा. जो इंपोर्ट बिल आएगा आपका, योर इंपोर्ट बिल इज लेस क्वांटिटी एंड वही 200 रुपये उनको मिलेंगे फॉर द 200 यूनिट्स. ये 200 कैसे आया? Q4 माइनस Q3 जो अब नया इंपोर्ट हो रहा है. सो फॉरेनर्स आर गेटिंग समवेयर अराउंड 40,000. One of the most important thing in this diagram which you should be able to mark and identify is कि government को कितना tariff मिलेगा. तो basically this region right here, which I'm highlighting in the red, so in this one the government is getting revenue, क्योंकि if you see, if I say tariff या tax का जो revenue है which the government is getting, basically the government is getting $100 for every unit that is being imported. So import quantity, as we've mentioned, is about 200, क्योंकि Q4 minus Q3 जो है, that's the import quantity. तो 100 की price into 200 units will tell us कि about 30,000 is government's revenue in this case, which is highlighted with this red space here. For O-level exam purpose, मैं तुमको almost like AS level का explanation दे दिया है. For your O-level exam, you should be able to draw tariff impose करने से क्या होगा. So for example, this is the quantity that you are importing initially, क्योंकि world supply, domestic demand की basis पे this is the quantity being imported. If tariff is imposed, what happens to the import quantities? ये तुम्हें आना चाहिए बताना कि imports are going to reduce. That's one thing. Prices are going to rise. That's the second thing. जब price rise कर रही है तो producers revenue is rising. That's your third thing. Consumers are paying higher prices to consume lesser goods. That's your fourth thing. And government gets some tariff के revenues. That's your fifth thing. That's how you are supposed to be able to explain कि basically what are the for and against arguments for imposing tariff over here. So I could just simply list them down just the way I suggested right now, that tariff लगने से import falls, producer revenue rises, consumers consumption at higher prices, demand falls down, tariffs की वजह से the prices go up. That was our first thing, in fact. And government को tax revenue मिलेगा. You should be able to show the same diagram कि what if government tariff हटा देती है, फिर क्या होगा. तो अगर गवर्नमेंट टैरिफ हटा देती है तो the opposite of what we have just suggested is going to happen. If the tariff is removed, the prices will go down, imports will rise, producer का जो revenue है that's going to go down, consumers का जो consumption है that is going to go up, and जो government का tax revenue है that's going to fall down. Exactly same diagram बनाओगे लेकिन सिर्फ अब arrows का direction change हो जाएगा. Instead of arrow going up, it's going to go down. Supply going up, supply is going to go down. These arrows are going to start moving in a downward direction, and that's all you have to show. That would be the opposite of the entire thing that we just mentioned. Another simpler diagram for a tariff situation is simply जो हम imported goods का मैं बना देता हूँ, imported goods का diagram. This one would be a simple demand and supply का diagram. Imported goods का ये. Imported goods इतनी quantity इतनी price पे बिक रहे हैं. इसके ऊपर जब गवर्नमेंट ने टैरिफ यानी इनडायरेक्ट टैक्स लगाया, जितनी अमाउंट से लगाओगे उतनी अमाउंट से सप्लाई कर्व इज गोइंग टू जंप अप, एंड एज अ रिजल्ट ऑफ दैट टैरिफ लगने की वजह से द प्राइस इज गोइंग टू राइज एंड द इंपोर्ट क्वांटिटी इज गोइंग टू फॉल. ये तुम्हारा सिंपल इंपोर्टेड गुड्स का डायग्राम है. जो पहला वाला डायग्राम था वो पूरा कॉम्प्लेक्स था, डोमेस्टिक मार्केट्स को देखते हुए था, बट दिस वन इज ऑल्सो एक्सेप्टेबल. लेकिन बस जस्ट मेक श्योर दैट यू हैव मेंशन्ड कि ये सिर्फ और सिर्फ इंपोर्टेड गुड्स का है. डोमेस्टिक मार्केट हैज़ नथिंग टू डू विद इट, डोमेस्टिक प्रोड्यूसर्स हैव नथिंग टू डू विद इट. सिंपली tariff, I'll write like imposition of import duty will raise the price of imported goods, and therefore the quantity demanded will fall. एक क्वेश्चन आ जाता है कि वो पूछते हैं कि अदर देन टैरिफ बताओ कि कोई दो और, यानी quotas and subsidies could be your other two barriers and you have to explain it. तो कोटा के बारे में हमको ये पता है कि कोटा is a physical limit. It's not a taxation or something of that sort. It's a physical limit on the quantity. Imported. So let's say मैं एक सिंपल सा imported goods का डायग्राम बनाता हूँ, just the way we did it for tariff in the end. तो imported goods के अंदर let's say we have a demand, we have a supply. This is normally what would have happened. Imported goods की demand, imported goods की supply, and this is the price. इतनी प्राइस के ऊपर इतनी क्वांटिटी इज बीइंग सोल्ड ऑफ इंपोर्टेड गुड्स. नाउ लेट्स से द करंट प्राइस वाज 500 and the quantity that was being imported was about 600 units. The government intervenes और कहती है there is a quota that you cannot import more than 500 of this good. So I've made a perfectly inelastic supply curve telling us that quantity cannot exceed the 500 mark. ये हमारा सप्लाई कर्व हो गया विद अ कोटा, इससे आगे आप जा ही नहीं सकते हो. So what's happening now as a result of this is that if quota of 500 units is imposed, then price for the good has changed, as quantity demanded is equals to quantity supplied at 500 has a price of, let me do the marking, about P1 की price आ जाती है. P1 की price, let's say 550 or so. So there's no revenue to the government, no revenue to the government जो tariff के अंदर मिल रहा था. Price has risen, quantity has fallen, so clearly import has gone down, and maybe that's what we were looking for. Our last barrier to trade, imports को reduce करने के लिए, we can use subsidies. Subsidies की definition you should be accurate with. Basically, subsidies is a financial incentive given to the producers of essential goods so they could lower the price and supply more. If prices fall, then the domestic good will be more competitive, therefore exports will rise and imports will fall. As far as the diagram goes, normal तुमको subsidy का diagram बनाना है इसके अंदर, with your demand and your supply, with your equilibrium. इस प्राइस पे इतनी क्वांटिटी ट्रेड हो रही है, और फिर जब सब्सिडीज मिलेंगी तो सप्लाई कर्व जो है हमारा डोमेस्टिक सप्लाई कर्व इज गोइंग टू शिफ्ट टू द राइट. As a result of that, the prices are going to go down and more quantity will be consumed. This is for the domestic good. So obviously we'll assume that अगर international prices अच्छी होंगी तो we'll be able to export more as well. And subsidy से जो हम imports को reduce करना चाह रहे थे, we will be able to do that.